They were told it was impossible. Patton's men were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered in a German forest. Facing the 1st SS, Hitler's personal guard, survival should have been hopeless. Yet in less than 18 hours, those ordinary soldiers did the unthinkable. They shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. The question is, how did they do it? What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? On March 6, 1945, in the dark forests of Germany, that question was no longer a matter of philosophy. It was a matter of blood, steel, and survival. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's own hand-picked guard, feared across Europe, was rolling forward with the same ruthless confidence that had crushed armies from Poland to the Ardennes. They believed the day would end, as it always had, with American soldiers scattered, burned, and broken before their tanks. But what they met was not weakness. What they met was not fear. What they met was something they had not expected at all. The men waiting in the mist were not supposed to stand. They were not supposed to endure. They were elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army, tired, undersupplied, and stretched thin after months of relentless combat. Their position was accidental, their defenses improvised, their numbers outmatched. To the German elite, this was just another routine slaughter. Yet, when dawn came, the forest erupted not in defeat, but in defiance. This is the story of how ordinary soldiers, farm boys, mechanics, immigrants, and officers barely older than the men they led, turned what should have been a massacre into one of the most remarkable defensive stands of the Second World War. It is the story of courage against inevitability, of ingenuity against doctrine, of free men refusing to yield even when every calculation said they would. On that day in March, Patton's men were not supposed to survive. And yet, it was precisely because they were not supposed to that survival became possible. Today, we dive into the clash that proved the American spirit could meet even the most fanatical Nazi elite head-on and change the course of battle when it mattered most. To understand the magnitude of the clash in March 1945, we must first understand the reputation of the enemy that approached through the German forests. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was no ordinary formation. Born in 1933 as Hitler's personal bodyguard, it had grown into a hardened, fanatical, armored division. These men were not simply soldiers. They were true believers, chosen for their loyalty, forged in the crucible of conquest. Wherever the Nazi war machine advanced, the Leibstandarte marched at its spearhead. From the very beginning, their record was written in blood. In Poland, they cut a path of terror that shocked Europe. In France, they smashed resistance with speed and ferocity. On the Eastern Front, they drove deep into Soviet soil, earning a reputation for ruthless efficiency. By 1944, they were feared above all as the vanguard of Germany's most desperate battles. Their savagery in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, where captured American prisoners were executed in cold blood at Malmedy, seared their name into infamy. When intelligence reports revealed that the 1st SS was moving once more, American soldiers knew exactly what that meant. It meant facing an enemy that killed without hesitation, an enemy that expected victory, an enemy that never surrendered. But this was no longer 1940. By March 1945, the Reich was collapsing. The Allies had pierced deep into Germany. Patton's Third Army had raced across France, stormed through the Saar, and was pressing toward the very heart of Hitler's empire. Yet momentum came at a cost. Supply lines stretched thin. Exhaustion gnawed at every man. Units were scattered, holding improvised positions while waiting for orders to advance again. It was in one such place, near the wooded hills around a small town called Stadtkill, that the collision would come. The Americans stationed there were no green recruits. They were combat veterans who had endured month after month of fire and blood. Infantrymen of the 94th Division, crews of Sherman tanks from the 8th Armored Division, artillerymen with 105mm howitzers that had pounded German strongholds across Europe. They had fought in hedgerows, in cities, across frozen rivers. They had learned, painfully, how to adapt to a ruthless enemy. Still, nothing about their assignment on March 6th suggested that this would become a fight for survival. The defensive ground was chosen not for strength, but for circumstance. Ridges offered some fields of fire, but there was little depth. No fallback positions, few avenues of retreat. Captain James Morrison, the senior officer on site, knew the reports of German movement. But reports are not reality. Reality arrived in the pre-dawn mist with the low growl of tank engines that sounded different from American ones. He would soon see the angular silhouettes of Panzers, Panthers, and even the dreaded Tiger II. Each bore the black insignia of the 1st SS. What drove the Germans into this battle wasn't hope of victory in the Grand War, but desperation. The Reich was collapsing on all fronts. Berlin itself was only weeks from encirclement. Yet Nazi leaders clung to a belief that a savage counterblow, even a local one, might bleed the Allies enough to force negotiations. For this, they committed their best remaining units. And so the 1st SS, masters of armored warfare, were ordered to smash through the thin American line, to break the Third Army's rhythm, to sow chaos behind the front. Against this, the Americans had only grit, discipline, and the memory of what had been done at Malmedy. They knew surrender was not an option. They knew that capture meant execution. And so, on the eve of battle, veterans and replacements alike tightened their helmets, checked their weapons, and looked into the dark woods from which death would soon emerge. This was the stage. A fanatical elite that believed itself unstoppable. A weary but battle-tested band of Americans, caught in exposed ground. And between them, the silence of the forest, waiting for dawn to shatter into fire. Dawn crept over the hills of Stadtkill on March 6, 1945, and with it came the low rumble of steel. At first, the Americans thought it was distant thunder rolling across the forest, but then the sound grew louder, clearer, distinctive. German tank engines, heavier and deeper than their own. The men of Captain James Morrison's mixed force knew instantly what was coming. This was no patrol. This was no probing skirmish. This was the full weight of the 1st SS Panzer Division moving straight toward them. Morrison's troops were positioned on a ridgeline, good for observation but poor for retreat. Infantry squads dug shallow foxholes. Machine guns covered the tree lines. A platoon of Sherman tanks crouched in defilade, hidden as best they could behind the rises. Behind them, 105mm howitzers stood ready, linked by radio to forward observers who peered into the fog. Every man knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned. And yet they stood their ground. Then, through the mist, the first shapes emerged. Panthers, sleek and deadly, their long-barreled guns swinging like predators searching for prey. Panzer IVs followed in tight formation, and towering behind them, the hulking silhouette of the Tiger II, the King Tiger, its armor almost impervious, its cannon capable of destroying a Sherman with a single shot. Alongside the armor moved SS Grenadiers in dark uniforms, slipping through the trees with practiced precision. The American defense was about to be tested. Morrison had received fragmentary intelligence that German armor was nearby, but nothing had prepared him for this. His men were exhausted from weeks of fighting. Ammunition was limited. The ground chosen was accidental, not ideal. And yet here they were, staring at the nightmare of every Allied soldier, the 1st SS in full strength. Why were the Germans here, in these woods, on this morning? The answer lay in desperation. With the Reich collapsing, commanders of the SS sought one last chance to reverse their fortunes. Their orders were simple: break through the American line, drive into the rear, and sow chaos. Perhaps they could delay Patton. Perhaps they could frighten the Allies into hesitation. Perhaps. But to the men on the ridge, those calculations mattered little. All that mattered was the enemy advancing toward them. The forest was eerily quiet for a moment, save for the growl of engines. Then the first shot rang out. A Sherman on the ridge fired, the recoil thundering across the valley. Its shell struck the side of a Panther, sparking harmlessly off thick armor. The German column responded with brutal precision. Cannons roared, trees shattered, earth erupted. A Sherman burst into flames, its crew scrambling desperately to escape. The battle had begun. What unfolded in those first hours was chaos and resolve in equal measure. The Americans were not supposed to hold. They were supposed to collapse under the weight of German armor. Yet, instead of panicking, they adapted. Shermans did not stand and duel. They moved constantly, darting from cover, firing, then shifting position before the Panthers could reply. Infantrymen with bazookas stalked the edges, waiting for a chance to strike from the flanks. Artillery observers called down fire within minutes, hammering German concentrations whenever they massed for an assault. Still, the cost was brutal. Every explosion shook the ground. Every hit on a Sherman reminded the men just how thin their armor was compared to the German behemoths. Yet, amidst the firestorm, something else became clear. This was not going to be another Malmedy. This was not going to be another easy slaughter for the SS. The Americans were fighting back, with grit, with ingenuity, with sheer refusal to die. By mid-morning, the ridges of Stadtkeil were wreathed in smoke. Dead and wounded lay scattered among shattered trees. But the line held. Against the most feared armored division of Nazi Germany, Patton's men had not broken. They had endured the storm. And the day was only beginning. The first assault struck like a hammer. At dawn, the SS attacked with textbook precision. Armor in the lead, infantry close behind, artillery in support. It was the same formula that had carried German armies from Warsaw to Paris, from Kiev to the Ardennes. And for a moment, it seemed unstoppable. Panzer IVs rolled forward, their guns flashing. Panther tanks prowled the edges, their long barrels seeking American armor hidden in the tree line. Then came the thunder of the Tiger II, its massive shell obliterating a Sherman in a single strike. SS Grenadiers advanced in disciplined lines, slipping through the forest, firing as they moved. Their objective was simple: punch a hole, widen it, and break the American defense apart. But the Americans did not crumble. They refused to fight on German terms. The Shermans, hopelessly outgunned in a duel, became something else entirely. They darted across the ridgeline, never staying still long enough to become easy targets. They fired, moved, fired again, serving as roving fire support rather than equals in a tank duel. Their survival depended not on armor, but on speed, coordination, and nerve. Behind them, the 105mm howitzers went to work. Forward observers crouched in foxholes with radios pressed to their ears, calling down fire with ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, German assembly areas were turned into craters of fire. SS tanks massing for a push suddenly found themselves under a storm of shells, forced to scatter, losing the momentum they relied upon. When they dispersed, American infantry with bazookas and rifle grenades struck from concealment, hitting isolated machines one by one. The battlefield became a patchwork of small, desperate fights. A machine gun nest firing until overrun. A Sherman crew holding its ground until flames drove them out. Infantry squads counterattacking with bayonets in hand when grenadiers pressed too close. Every man, from riflemen to cooks, from mechanics to medics, became part of the firing line. This was not the clean, ordered battle of doctrine. This was survival. Yet in survival, there was innovation. Communication flowed freely up and down the chain. A corporal's idea could shift the line. A sergeant's quick order could change the tempo of the fight. Unlike their enemies, bound by rigid doctrine and blind faith in superiority, the Americans adapted with each passing minute. Tank crews shared ammunition with riflemen. Artillery observers doubled as gunners. The defense was no longer separate pieces. It was one organism, fighting as a whole. Still, the cost was merciless. Sherman after Sherman was knocked out. The ridgeline shook under the impact of German shells. Trees splintered into deadly fragments. Men fell, and the line bent under pressure. Yet it did not break. Every time the SS surged forward, they met a storm of fire. Every time they attempted to outflank, another hidden gun spoke, another ambush bled their strength. The clash raged for hours. Smoke hung over the forest, choking and acrid. The ground itself seemed to tremble with each exchange. But as the morning turned to afternoon, something remarkable was becoming clear. The German advance was slowing. Their confidence, so absolute at the outset, now collided with an enemy that refused to collapse. The Americans, outnumbered, undersupplied, outgunned, were still there. And every hour they endured, the 1st SS lost a little more of its aura of invincibility. What was supposed to be a swift breakthrough had become a grinding contest of wills. The Americans had not only survived the initial storm, they had forced the elite of Nazi Germany into a fight they did not expect. A fight of improvisation, a fight of stubbornness, a fight where the difference between life and death came down not to doctrine, but to the courage of ordinary men holding the line. By mid-afternoon, the battle had become a test of endurance. The SS pressed forward with unrelenting fury. American lines bent, cracked, but refused to break. Smoke choked the forest. Shells ripped through the ridgeline. Sherman tanks burned, their wrecks glowing like funeral pyres. And yet, amidst the destruction, moments of brilliance were born. One such moment came from Sergeant Thomas, Tank Wilson. His Sherman had been struck by a German round, its tracks shattered, its mobility gone. For many, that would have meant abandonment. But Wilson refused to leave his machine. He realized that the gun still worked. The turret could still turn. The cannon could still fire. He ordered his crew to stay inside, to keep fighting from a stationary fortress. Over the radio, Wilson gave an audacious command. He called on the remaining Shermans to form around him, not in retreat, but in defiance. Together they built what would later be called an armored hedgehog. Disabled tanks became fixed gun platforms. Mobile Shermans maneuvered around them, drawing fire, feeding targets, shielding their crippled brothers. The formation was crude, improvised, and desperate. But it worked. When the SS armor surged for the kill, they were met with overlapping fields of fire. A Panther that swung to flank was struck from 2 angles at once. A Tiger II, massive and unstoppable, rolled forward only to find itself bracketed by artillery called in with deadly precision. What should have been easy prey had transformed into a fortress of steel, bristling with defiance. Wilson's gamble had bought the line precious time. But the innovations did not stop there. Among the Americans was Private First Class Roberto Martinez, a young radio operator. Born in Mexico, he had come to the United States only years earlier, seeking a better life. Now, in the heart of Germany, he was fighting to preserve it. Between barrages, he noticed something, an unusual rhythm in the German attacks. A surge, a lull, a regrouping, always the same cycle. Martinez proposed an idea. If they could intercept the German frequencies, perhaps they could anticipate the next move before it came. It was bold, it was risky, and it had never been attempted by men under such fire. But Martinez was no ordinary operator. He had been a radio technician before the war. He understood the German language. He knew the mechanics of the equipment. With scavenged parts, he improvised a listening post, tuning into the very heart of the enemy's communications. Within hours, his idea changed the battle. For the first time, Captain Morrison's men were not simply reacting. They were anticipating. When German armor gathered for a push, artillery was already waiting. When grenadiers shifted to the flank, bazooka teams were there first. What had been desperation became prediction. What had been survival became control. The SS commanders grew furious. Their doctrine told them victory was inevitable. Their faith told them they were superior. Yet here, against an inferior force, their blows landed on air. Every assault stalled. Every maneuver met resistance. They misread ingenuity as luck, and they repeated their failures until the forest was littered with burning steel. By nightfall, the climax had arrived. The 1st SS threw its heaviest blow. Panthers advancing in line, infantry swarming the ridges, artillery saturating the tree line. The Americans held. The Hedgehog spewed fire. Martinez's radios crackled with intercepted orders, feeding artillery batteries that tore holes in German formations. The ridgeline glowed with muzzle flashes. Every man, every weapon, every ounce of will was poured into the fight. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield was a graveyard of machines. Panthers gutted, tigers burning, SS grenadiers scattered among shattered trees. The Americans had not only survived, they had forced the most feared division of the Reich to recoil. Against all odds, outnumbered and outgunned, they had matched the fanatical elite blow for blow and turned desperation into triumph. The climax was not just a moment of victory. It was proof. Proof that doctrine could be broken. Proof that fanaticism could be outmatched by creativity. Proof that free men, fighting for each other, could face down tyranny's best and live. As darkness fell over the hills of Stadtkeil, the battlefield finally grew quiet. For 18 relentless hours, fire and steel had consumed the forest. Now only the crackle of burning tanks and the groans of the wounded broke the silence. The 1st SS Panzer Division, which had begun the day certain of another slaughter, was withdrawing. Behind them they left a trail of wreckage, 17 destroyed or abandoned tanks, over 200 casualties, and a reputation no longer untouchable. The Americans had held the line, but the price was staggering. Captain Morrison's mixed force had been reduced by nearly 60%. Sherman wrecks smoldered along the ridge. Infantry foxholes stood empty where their occupants had fallen. Medics worked by flashlight, pulling the wounded from shattered earth, binding wounds with trembling hands, whispering comfort in voices hoarse from smoke. Among the survivors there was no celebration, only exhaustion, only disbelief. They had expected death. Many had prepared themselves never to see another dawn. Yet against all odds, they had endured. The cost, however, was burned into their memories. The screams of men trapped in burning armor, the faces of comrades who would never leave those woods. Survivors would carry those ghosts for the rest of their lives. Still, even in the midst of devastation, there were moments of humanity. American medics treated German wounded as well as their own, dragging SS soldiers to cover, staunching their bleeding, offering water. Many Germans refused the help, spitting out morphine, choosing death rather than accepting aid from men they had been taught to despise. The contrast was stark. One side bound by fanaticism, the other guided, even in blood, by a belief in human worth. As reports filtered back to Patton's command, the magnitude of what had occurred became clear. A small, exposed American force had stood against the Reich's most feared division, and held. The tactical victory was undeniable, but the psychological impact was even greater. The aura of the 1st SS, once the terror of Allied soldiers, had been cracked. They could be stopped. They could be bled. They could be beaten. The battlefield itself bore witness to the struggle. The ridgeline was torn open, pocked with craters, littered with twisted steel. The air smelled of oil, blood, and cordite. Trees lay splintered like matchsticks, their trunks charred black. And scattered among them, personal relics, helmets, rifles, letters, photographs, reminders that behind every statistic was a human life ended too soon. For the men who survived, the aftermath was not triumph, but a heavy silence. Some sat in the mud, staring blankly into the flames. Others searched the dark for missing comrades. A few simply lay down where they stood, too drained to move. They had proven themselves against the best Germany could send. But the victory was paid for in blood, and the weight of that payment pressed down on every survivor's shoulders. When dawn broke the next morning, the forest was still. The 1st SS was gone. The Americans, bloodied but unbroken, still held the ridges. They had stood against what was supposed to be inevitable, and they had endured. In the wreckage of Stadtkeil, amidst the silence and the smoke, the outcome was clear. The 1st SS had met their match, and Patton's men, though they were not supposed to survive, had done more than survive. They had endured long enough to make history. The battle at Stadtkeil was more than a clash of tanks and men. It was a revelation. In the cold fire of March 1945, the myth of invincibility that surrounded the 1st SS Panzer Division was broken. For years, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had been the sharpest spear of the Reich. They had cut across Europe with ruthless speed, their name whispered with fear by every enemy they faced. Yet in the end, they were stopped, not by overwhelming numbers, not by superior weapons, but by a small, improvised American force that refused to yield. From that day forward, the lessons of Stadtkeil echoed far beyond the ridges of the Eifel forest. The improvised armored hedgehog formation pioneered by Sergeant Wilson became doctrine, taught as a model of adaptive defense. The radio intercepts engineered by Private First Class Roberto Martinez inspired Allied intelligence units to expand battlefield monitoring across the front. What had begun as desperate improvisation under fire soon shaped the way future armies would fight. But the legacy was not only tactical, it was cultural. The Americans proved that victory does not always belong to the side with the heaviest armor or the most rigid doctrine. It can belong to the side that adapts faster, that listens to its men, that allows creativity to rise even from the lowest rank. In a military shaped by democratic ideals, ideas flowed upward. A private's insight could save a company. A sergeant's daring could shift a battle. That flexibility was something the SS, bound by fanaticism and rigid hierarchy, could never match. The contrast was stark. For the SS, Ideology was both their strength and their prison. They believed their superiority was ordained. They fought as though victory was inevitable. When faced with innovation they could not understand, they faltered, repeating failed attacks until their strength bled away. For the Americans, survival demanded innovation, and innovation demanded trust in each other, in their leaders, in the belief that every man's contribution mattered. That trust turned the tide. The human cost was undeniable. The survivors of Stadtkill carried scars, both visible and hidden, for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke of that day. Some could not forget the faces of friends lost in the smoke. Yet they also carried pride. Pride that they had stood against the very best the Reich could send, and they had endured. Their sacrifice became part of a larger truth, that ordinary citizens, when called upon, could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. Historians would later write that the tactical impact of the battle was limited. Germany was already collapsing. The Reich had only weeks left to live. But the symbolic impact was profound. In those 18 hours, the 1st SS discovered that the American soldier was not a pawn to be crushed, but an opponent who could match their ferocity with resilience, their doctrine with ingenuity, their fanaticism with sheer determination. Today, the ridges near Stadtkill are quiet. Trees have grown back where shells once tore the earth apart. The scars of war have faded into the soil, but the story endures. It reminds us that democracy's greatest strength is not in perfect leaders or flawless machines. It is in the ability of free people to adapt, to create, and to fight for one another when the world is falling apart. The 1st SS expected another routine victory. Instead, they met their match. And Patton's men who were never supposed to survive, did more than survive. They proved that even in the darkest moments, when the enemy seems unstoppable, the resilience of ordinary men can rewrite the outcome of history.